Well, good morning. Glad to have the opportunity to talk with you for a little bit, to spend some time worshiping, albeit in, again, our non-traditional way. And we continue to do the best we can in difficult circumstances. It was so good to hear from so many of you this week. It seems as if many of you are doing well. We're continuing to make the best out of difficult circumstances, and we're glad that we can still communicate with the technology that we have. We can still continue to fellowship with one another, albeit not in the way that we would traditionally like to do. I want to talk just a little bit this morning to kind of focus our minds on some biblical things. But one of the things that I have found is that it's just hard to escape what's going on. It's hard to not think about the things that are occurring. And one of the things that I've noticed is as people have more free time, as people are thinking more about what's going on around them, one of the questions that I've seen pop up and had people in several particular cases, not anybody actually locally here, but I've seen a lot of discussion about the nature of the virus. And I'm not actually talking about from a medical perspective. I'm not talking about from even an economic perspective, but from a biblical perspective. From the Bible's perspective, how should we view coronavirus? And I've even had a couple of people propose the idea and ask the question, should we take coronavirus as a curse? Should we see this as some method of judgment of God upon our nation, upon the entire world? Should we be viewing this through a biblical lens? And frankly, I always think it's a good idea to look at what the Bible says about a topic. I think it's always good to ask questions about what does the Bible say about something. And so really, I just want to look at what this question would entail. What does this idea of a curse, of a sickness being a plague, is there any evidence for something like coronavirus being a sickness from God? And regardless of whether the answer is yes or no, we're going to investigate what it says. How would we respond either way? If it is a plague from God, how do we respond? And if it's just a normal sickness, how do we respond? And that's really what we want to be able to take away from this, is ultimately, what is a Christian response to this idea? What is a Christian response to what's going on? So the very first question we have to ask is, does God use sickness as a tool of judgment? Does he use plagues as a way to communicate his frustrations and his disappointments with people? And that's probably a really obvious question, because we know the answer is yes. Probably immediately you're thinking in your mind of the plagues against Egypt, against these various things that were sent as judgment against the nation of Israel, the boils and the flies and frogs and all these different things, even the darkness, and ultimately the death of the firstborn. So certainly that's an easy example. But I actually want to take a look at a couple of others against Israel herself, because it's easy to think about Egypt and, they were doing the wrong thing. But even Israel, God's chosen people, when they were not doing what they were supposed to be doing, could also suffer the results of a plague. Open your Bibles up, if you will, to the book of Numbers. And Numbers, as we have talked about, is a bit of a train wreck for Israel. Numbers is by no means the finest hour of Israel. Although, frankly, as you read the Old Testament, there's not many finest hours of Israel. I mean, you got the book of Joshua, pretty good by and large. Other than that, there's not a whole lot of books where Israel just comes out smelling like roses. But Numbers is pretty much the whole book. They look pretty bad. And so in Numbers chapter 16, we have Korah's rebellion. And so he and several of the Levites rebel against the leadership of Moses and Aaron. They're struck down. But then there's actually a second rebellion that takes place where the whole congregation of Israel murmurs and complains and blames Moses and Aaron for the deaths of Korah and for all these people. And so what's going to occur is actually there's going to be judgment again on the whole congregation now. And so it's going to say that in verse 43 of chapter 16, that Moses and Aaron came to the front of the tent of the meeting. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Get away from amongst the congregation, that I may consume them instantly." Then they fell on their faces. Moses said to Aaron, "Take your censer and put in it fire from the altar, lay incense upon it, then bring it quickly to the congregation and make atonement for them, for wrath has gone forth from the Lord, the plague has begun." Then Aaron took it as Moses had spoken, ran into the midst of the assembly, for behold, the plague had begun among the people. So he put on the incense and made atonement for the people. He took his stand between the living and the dead, so that the plague was checked. But those who died by the plague were 14,700, besides those who died on account of Korah. Then Aaron returned to Moses at the doorway of the tent of meeting, for the plague had been checked. Truly, this is a terrifying illness. 14,700 people die in what appears to be a matter of minutes. I mean, that's the worst death rate, I think, of any plague you ever see. And it's almost instantaneous, it seems, that people just start falling dead from this terrible sickness from the Lord. So we do see that plagues are used as punishment by God against Israel when they do wrong, when they are wicked. And we actually see another instance of this in what we were reading this week in Amos chapter 4, which, by the way, if reading Amos, he is so good. Amos is just such an incredible book. And it is quickly becoming one of my favorite pieces of prophetic literature. And I'm probably going to say that every week about the prophets because they're all so good. But Amos just punches you right in the mouth with what he's trying to make clear to you about social justice, about religious falsehood, about terrible leadership. I mean, he is brutal against what the Israelites are doing. And in chapter 4, he brings up this idea in one of his oracles against Israel, that God has been trying to talk to them. God has been trying to really kind of slap them in the face and be like, guys, I'm trying to tell you what's going to happen. I'm trying to warn you that you're not going down the right path. And so he talks about how he sent famine, how he sent danger, how he sent other nations as warnings to try to correct Israel back onto the right path. The prophets themselves were evidence of God trying to bring the people back to a right relationship with God. And one of the things that he says, Amos does, in chapter 4 and verse 10, is that I sent a plague among you after the manner of Egypt. And then later on, yet you have not returned to me. So not only does God use plague as a system of judgment, as a punishment for wrongdoing, but he also uses sickness and plague as a way to try to bring people back from poor behavior. He's trying to use it to warn Israel of a greater destruction to come, and he's trying to use the plague to turn them back from the disastrous path that they are on. So we would have to answer the question, if somebody asks, does God use sickness for his purposes? Well, yes, I think we see multiple instances where plague is used to punish, it's used to rebuke, it's used to correct. So certainly there is a possibility and there's a evidence that God has used plague in the past. Now, having said that, does every plague mandate that that's God's punishment? Is every bout of sickness, is every instance of pandemic proof that God is judging a certain group of people? And to that, I don't think there's as quick a yes answer. In fact, I would probably actually say that no, I don't think we should make the assumption that every plague, every sickness, every individual case of the cold is God trying to judge someone or God trying to rebuke or trying to correct someone. Part of what we need to realize is that sickness is a current condition that the world suffers from. If you turn over to the very beginning of the Bible in Genesis, one of the things that we see is that when God creates the world, when God lays out the foundations and he's creating all these things, one of the things that's repeatedly said in Genesis chapter 1 is that it was good. The sun and the stars were good. The divide of land and sea was good. Animals were good. Birds were good. Fish were good. Eventually, after man, everything was very good. It's a sense that there is no wrong in creation. There's no evil in creation. Well, one of the things that we know is that the idea of death is portrayed as an unnatural part of creation. That death was not one of the intents of creation. It was not the desire of God. In fact, death is the opposite of God. And so a lot of times we hear that terminology that, death is a natural part of life. And while that sounds well-meaning, and certainly everybody does undergo death, death is not natural. Death is a consequence of the fall. And I think we can label sickness under that same type of idea, that sickness is a consequence of the fall. In Genesis chapter 3, as we read of the curses that are being placed because of the results of Adam and Eve's sin, in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 17, God says to Adam, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying you shall not eat from it, cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall grow for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread, till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So part of this curse on man is not just a curse that he's going to have to work hard, but the creation itself, the earth itself is under this curse. The ground does not yield its fruit as well now. You now have aberrations of plants, of thorns and thistles, of negative things have now been corrupted in creation. And so we see that the consequences of sin reach far beyond just mankind. They reach far beyond just Adam and Eve and their physical descendants. The entire world suffers under the effects of sin. And in fact, Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 5, in multiple places in Romans, but in Romans chapter 5, he links this idea that not only has man suffered consequences of sin, but the physical creation, earth, has suffered the consequences of sin. And so in Romans chapter 5 and verse 12, Paul says, therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. And so to Paul, the fall of man was a global changing event. It was not just a state of spiritual decay for mankind, but there was physical consequences to it as well. All of creation suffers because of this. And he picks this idea up again in chapter 8, when he says in chapter 8 and verse 19, for the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. And not only this, but also we ourselves, having the first fruit of the spirits, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. And so to Paul, the creation account was corrupted by sin. Now again, this doesn't downplay the authority of God, doesn't downplay the sovereignty of God, but when sin entered into the world, it was a corruption of man and the physical creation. So we can, I think, easily say that sickness and disease and ultimately the death that comes from it, that's all part of the corruption, and it's all part of the impurity of creation that's going to be removed when God comes and he cleanses the world. When that fire of judgment comes, it's going to remove all this wickedness. Creation is going to be renewed through the Creator once again. And so we see this idea that disease and death and thorns and thistles and all these things, all these negative aspects, those are not part of the original creation. And so part of what we can say is that sickness, whether it's coronavirus or whether it's cold or whether it's any other type of sickness, in some capacity, sickness is simply a consequence of the fall. So we see two biblical principles. We see on one hand, sometimes disease does originate from God. Sometimes plagues are used for both judgment and for rebuke to try to correct someone before an ultimate form of judgment. But we also see that some sickness is simply the result of a creation corrupted by sin, a death that has entered into where life should be. So, which is it? Is this a judgment? Is this a rebuke from God? Or is this just a part of the creation being corrupted by sin? Well, if you're thinking I'm going to answer this, I'm not. Because the reality is that we don't know. Now, you might immediately be saying, well, there's no way that this is judgment. Is it? I don't think we can say that. Is it just a disease? It could be. But I think the reality is that we don't really know. I don't think there actually is a way to definitively answer this. And that may seem like a cop-out. You may be saying, okay, Andrew, it's 15 minutes into the sermon. Why on earth have you preached this if you have no answer for it? But I think there's actually a really important biblical point to draw from this. That's the idea that allergies are a consequence of sin. Allergies are a horrible part of creation. I don't believe they're natural. No, that's not my point. I think there's a very important point for us to understand that we're not always aware of why things are occurring. And in fact, we actually see multiple times in the Bible that people basically say, I don't know. I don't know why exactly something is happening. And I want to look at a couple of these examples because I think this is a really important thing for us to understand. The most, I think, profound example of this is go ahead and turn over to the book of Esther. And so in Esther chapter 5, we know the story of Esther very well. We know that, that's going to be Esther chapter 4, I believe. We know that Haman is plotting to kill all of the Jews. Esther and Mordecai have become aware of this, or Mordecai has become aware of it, and he's now telling Esther of this plan. And he wants her to try to do something to try to stop it. She's the only Jew in a position to stop any of this. And so in verse 13 of chapter 4, it says, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this?" Who knows? Now, from our perspective, this seems obvious. Well, of course, God's at work, and that's why Esther has become queen of Persia, is so that she can spare the Jews in this time period. This is all part of God's great plan. And that is really obvious to us 2,000 years later because God's revealed it to us. But that's not obvious to Mordecai in this moment. Mordecai's doing the best he can with the information he has. He goes, I don't know why this has occurred. I don't know necessarily why you're queen, but maybe God's planned this. Maybe God is at work in all of this. Who knows? Look at another example with me in 2 Samuel chapter 12. This is right after the story of David and Bathsheba, when Nathan comes and he lets David know of the great sin that he's committed, and David repents, but Nathan tells him that the child of his union with Bathsheba is still going to die. And eventually the child does in fact die, and David, who has been weeping and mourning and tearing his clothes, and he's been ashy, he's been moaning and groaning, they tell him that he's dead. Well, actually, they're too scared to tell the king that the child is dead. They're like, he may hurt himself. And David sees all of them talking, and he says, the child is dead, isn't he? And they're like, yeah, he is. And the king goes about as normal. He goes and he washes himself and he prepares and he starts to eat. And all the servants are like, what is this? When the child was alive, you were freaking out, and now you're all normal. What's going on? He said in verse 22 of chapter 12, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me, that the child may live. But now he has died. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." Again, you see this idea of David saying, I don't know what the will of the Lord is. I know he's told me what's going to happen. I know he has prophesied by Nathan that the child is going to die, but I don't know. Maybe he'll spare the child. Maybe if I weep and if I fast, maybe it won't come to pass. Maybe God will have mercy on me. I don't know. Look at another example with me. Another prophetic example in the book of Jonah that we just read last week. This is a similar response, actually, of the pagans of Nineveh when they are confronted with the terrible news that Nineveh is about to fall in 40 days. And again, Jonah doesn't tell them there's any other reproach to this. He just says, hey, your city's about to fall. In Jonah chapter 3 and verse 9, as the king of Nineveh is like, put on sackcloth, everybody start mourning, he says, who knows? God may turn and relent and withdraw his burning anger, so that we will not perish. And so I hope you're seeing from the repetition of all of this, this is actually a really consistent reply of God-fearing people of, I don't know. Who knows? Maybe God is trying to tell us something. Maybe God will have mercy on us for this. Maybe God would. We don't know. And I think there's an enormous amount of humility present in people that have the strength of mind to say, I don't know what the will of the Lord is right now. I don't know what's going to occur in this. I know that God's good. I know that God is going to let the right things happen, but I don't know what that's going to look like. And that's an uncomfortable thing for us to talk about, that we don't know. The lack of confidence in what exactly is going to occur. Now, I want to be clear, that's not a lack of confidence in God. It's really a lack of confidence in ourselves. It's a realization that we don't know exactly what's going to happen. And in fact, that's actually a New Testament point as well. We know from the book of James, in James chapter 4, that James makes this very point to the Christians of his day. He says, you guys act like you have an exact knowledge of what's going to occur. You guys are acting like you're going to go to this city and you're going to make all this much money and you're going to do all these things. And you say it with such confidence that you know exactly what's going to occur. But he says in James chapter 4 and verse 14, he says, yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance, and such boasting is evil. Therefore, to one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, it is sin. So this is an important biblical principle for us to understand, that we don't always know what's going on. We're not always firmly aware of what's going on. Could this coronavirus be judgment against our nation or another nation or against the whole world? It could be. Could it be a rebuke by God, an attempt to turn back judgment from us, trying to get our nation to listen to God again? It could be. Is this just a normal sickness that occurs because of all of the terrible things that resulted from the fall of man? It could be. We don't know. Who knows? So what's the point of all of this? We're now 20 minutes into this and you're thinking, okay, Andrew, you have basically given us the equivalent of what's the point of all of this? I want to look at one more passage. In 2 Samuel chapter 10, one of my favorite characters, not because he's necessarily a good guy, but I think he's a fascinating character, the character of Joab. In 2 Samuel 10, Joab and his brother Abishai are fighting on behalf of King David to fight against the Ammonites, one of the dread enemies of Israel. And as Joab is drawing up all the battle plans and he's saying he's going to divide the forces, they're going to surround him and all these things, he says in verse 12 to his brother, be strong and let us show ourselves courageous for the sake of our people and for the cities of our God. And may the Lord do what is good in his sight. Think about the level of trust and faith that Joab is showing here. He's about to fight for the Lord on behalf of the Lord's anointed, the king, against the enemies of the Lord. But he doesn't take it into arrogance that I'm going to win this battle. He says, we're going to do the best we can. We're going to set up this military strategy. We're going to be strong and courageous. We're going to do everything we can in our control. And then we're going to trust that the Lord is going to do what is right in his eyes. And we're going to be content with whatever that actually looks like. I think there's an enormous lesson for us to be drawn from there. We don't know why what's occurring right now is. And I would tell you that anybody with great confidence that says this either is one thing or it isn't another, they're speaking out of arrogance. We don't know what the Lord is doing right now. We're not firmly committed either way. And I think there's enormous faith in saying, I don't know exactly why this is occurring, but we're going to be strong, we're going to be courageous, and we're going to trust that the Lord will do what is right in his sight. And we're going to pray that the Lord's will be done in this situation. That may not look good. We may not like what the Lord's will looks like. The Lord may will that we stay in quarantine for another 6 months. I'm not hoping that's the case. I don't want that to occur. But whatever the Lord wills for this situation, whether it to be that this pandemic continues for whatever amount of time, whether it be that it miraculously is cured tomorrow, whatever the Lord wills, we have faith that that's the right thing to do. And we're going to trust in the Lord's plans rather than our own. That takes an enormous amount of humility. It takes a lot of courage to basically let go and say, I'm not in control of this situation. I'm going to let go of it. I'm not going to proclaim what's going to happen in a week. I'm not going to say what I'm going to do in a month or 2 months. I'm going to say, you know what? Whatever the Lord wills, that's what I want to occur. And I'm going to do the best I can to act according to what the Bible teaches me. And then I'm going to leave it all up to the rest of God. I'm going to be strong. I'm going to be courageous. and I'm going to go fight the fights God calls me to fight. And I'm going to leave the end results up to him. I know that's probably a little bit of an unorthodox lesson, and I know it doesn't really answer the question that I sought to answer, but I think it's the only biblical answer. Who knows? May the Lord's will be done. I hope that's encouraging to you. I hope that gives you some things to think about and some things to pray about. If you haven't already prayed it, pray that the Lord's will in this situation be done. Give your request to him. By no means am I saying just throw your hands up. Pray for healing for our nation. Pray for salvation for our people. Pray that this plague, which is terrible, and that the deaths that are occurring, which are terrible, pray that it does end. But pray that all of it is done according to what the Lord wills. And whatever the Lord's will is, whether it's good or whether it doesn't look so good, have faith that he is going to do what is right. Have faith that no matter how much it may look odd to us, God's going to make happen what needs to make happen. I hope that encourages you all. I hope that gives you some things to think about. And I hope we can all pray that in all sincerity, that the Lord's will be done, and may all that he has planned come to pass. Thank you so much for taking some time to consider these things with me this morning. I pray that it is a benefit to you. I pray that it encourages you. And I pray that we can all continue to edify one another, that we can all continue to lift one another up in prayer and continue to look forward for the Lord's will to be done. Thank you so much. We love you all. We hope to see you as soon as we can. And thanks for listening.